The podcasting technology of NORML is made possible by Red Aphid Interactive Media. More information at redaphid.com. And distributed by the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws in Washington, D.C. This is your daily audio stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Welcome to the most popular audio podcast regarding marijuana in all of America and all the world, featuring interviews with scientists, politicians, doctors, prohibition policy activists, regular cannabis consumers, musicians, and NORML staff and NORML's board of directors, along with music and comedy no other podcast can offer. You can always find out more about the show at our website, NORMLAudiostash.com. We're ending marijuana prohibition with education, one listener at a time. Welcome back to the Audio Stash today. It is Wednesday, May 23rd. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Take a moment to join us at NORML to end marijuana prohibition in America. Just visit NORML.org. We'll have our regular Wednesday segment with Dr. Mitch Earlywine on cannabis science here today. We'll also have a special memorial for Dr. Todd Micarea, who passed away on Sunday. We'll speak with his longtime friends and colleagues about his life and his work. Let's get to a subject that would be nowhere without Dr. Micarea. Let's get to our cannabis science segment with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Each Wednesday here on the Audio Stash, we get the chance to discuss the science of cannabis with Dr. Mitch Earlywine. Mitch is professor of psychology at State University of New York, author of the book Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book Pot Politics. We have links to the books on our website at NORMLAudiostash.com. Hey, Mitch, welcome back to the Audio Stash today.
Oh, happy to be back, Chris.
Great to speak with you today, Mitch. Now, we're going to discuss a story from NORML's weekly press release last week that cannabis use may improve brain function in schizophrenic, study says. Now, you and I have had long discussions as to why anyone diagnosed with schizophrenia currently should not use cannabis, but this study suggested that those patients who had used cannabis before their first psychotic break actually have better levels of cognition now.
This study blows my mind, and I want to thank Paul for doing a great job of summarizing this on the NORML website because it's really complicated, and I thought he boiled it down really nicely. The bottom line with this is that, yes, folks who were pretty heavily cannabis involved before age 16 or 17 and then later developed schizophrenia ended up more intact on a bunch of cognitive tasks than folks who developed schizophrenia and hadn't had that cannabis exposure. And it's such a strange finding. I thought, oh, this must be a fluke. But in fact, in 2005, we had another paper that was very comparable to this of a 10-year follow-up of folks who were cannabis involved prior to psychotic break and then had their cognitive functioning assessed again. And sure enough, it was the same sort of result. I am hard-pressed to say exactly what's going on here. There's an interesting idea that maybe, there's something about cannabis that's, an antioxidant, like Bob Malamud has discussed on the show before, and that maybe that's preserving some of these neurons and some of this functioning. Folks who are highly cannabis involved, at least in this sample, ended up being on smaller doses of the antipsychotic meds, and those may be the source of some of this cognitive impairments. It's only a couple of tests out of a big battery, but it's comparable to the ones that we've seen before. It's just an amazing finding, and of course, I wouldn't recommend anybody smoke cannabis that early in life, particularly if they've got schizophrenia in the family. But it's definitely letting us know that the cannabinoid system is really important in preserving the functioning of neurons, and we've seen this in some of the Alzheimer's data as well. So I do feel like cannabinoid medicine has really got a lot of potential as far as saving our own brain cells, if you will.
And again, those out there who are currently diagnosed with schizophrenia should definitely avoid cannabis for a variety of reasons. But also, Mitch, we've seen some studies suggesting marijuana affects the brains of teenagers slightly differently than adults. And what you're saying in this set of schizophrenics, they were heavily into cannabis as teenagers, but then showed improved cognition later. So how does all of this come together? Is the brain just still this immense mystery?
Well, I think the interesting caveat with this sample is that the folks who didn't have psychosis and were cannabis involved earlier in life had cognitive deficits. And we've seen that in at least one other longitudinal data set. And we've seen some deviations in the proportion of white and gray matter in the brain in folks who are heavy cannabis users before age 17 or 18. I think what's going on is there's this prime development during, late adolescence, and that if the brain isn't fully developed, the impact of cannabis can be markedly more dramatic right at that age. Well, as it turns out, that's also a pretty important period of development in association with the psychotic disorders. And so it's curious that it would be beneficial for folks who develop schizophrenia, but actually detrimental for folks who do not. But when you think about just the plasticity of the neurons, the way all these systems have to work together and communicate with each other, that's where it may be going on. And when you look at the tasks that were affected, they're tasks that require a whole bunch of different skills. It's not just attention or just perception. One of them has to do with transforming digits into these odd shapes and having to do it very rapidly, and this combination of speed and attention and holding things in memory is not just a single part of the brain. It's a communication across different brain areas, and I think that may be the important component to this. And the idea that cannabis would preserve that in a brain that has gone awry in other ways in the psychotic folks is not that outrageous an idea. But then that in contrast for folks who aren't developing any psychotic symptoms, that it would be an impairment is also conceivable when you look at how the folks who don't have any psychotic symptoms actually tend to do better overall. So even if they are cannabis involved, if they aren't psychotic, they tend to do better.
And in speaking about cognition here, Mitch, there was another recent study where cannabis consumers were given the Iowa gambling test immediately after smoking a joint, and their accuracy actually improved, but their time also got longer. So marijuana smokers may take a little more time, but actually performed better.
And one of these tests is very much a time-sensitive power kind of test where you have to do things rapidly. And, it's not stunning to learn that cannabis would slow some of that down. And that Iowa test is comparable to another one of the ones that was affected in these data where people have to sort of inhibit an impulse. You don't want to go with your first impression. You actually have to hang on a minute and figure something out before you respond. And in fact, that's the one where the schizophrenics who were cannabis involved seem to do okay.
Righto, Mitch. I want to thank you for joining us here again this Wednesday for our Cannabis Science segment.
Super.
Thanks again, Mitch. Dr. Mitch Earlywine is professor of psychology at State University of New York. He's author of the book Understanding Marijuana, A New Look at the Scientific Evidence, and editor of the new book Pot Politics. We have links to the books on our website at normalaudiostash.com. On the Audio Stash, we're going to take a look at the life and work of Dr. Todd Micarea. On Sunday, Dr. Micarea, one of the world's foremost authorities on the therapeutic use of cannabis, passed away after a multi-year battle with cancer. Here's Dr. Mikaria being interviewed at the Santa Barbara Conference for Medical Marijuana in 2006.
Once upon a time, I was struck by an inappropriate attack of curiosity when I was a sophomore in medical school. I came across an unassigned chapter in the pharmacology textbook Goodman and Gilman, a standard reference, and was fascinated by a 9-page chapter about cannabis, and learned that it had significant medical usage before, for some reason, it was taken away in about 1940. And that peak of curiosity launched me on a career. And this was back in 1959. I insinuated my way into the National Institute of Mental Health, where I was put in charge of the first overground cannabis research program in 1967. Curiosity and also a sense of justice and appropriate medical practice, because it turns out that cannabis is far less dangerous than most any other medication you can think of, especially when dealing with chronic conditions. Mm-hmm. And that cannabis should be looked upon as a first line of medication instead of it being something that you try after you give up on all the conventional treatments. Right. Yeah. And especially in the area of mental health, because as a psychiatrist, I can attest to the very negative side effects of chronic use of antipsychotics and other specific psychotherapeutic drugs. All drugs. There is no free lunch. There are always effects and side effects. Cannabis could be used to treat a whole spectrum of psychiatric conditions, but because of the ignorance and bias, are not used. Well, you see, that's the problem. Who do you complain to when you're dealing with the hen house watching fox? You can't really complain. What do you do with Bill Lockyer, that scum that has done a lot to block the implementation of the Compassionate Use Act of 1996? What do you do to these indwelling criminals under color of authority that continue to make the stupid and harmful decisions in prescribing medications? Well, we need to have medical treatment turned over to medical personnel instead of allowing probation officers, judges, and prosecutors dictate what kinds of psychotropics. I'm going to mention this afternoon about a couple cases where a pharmacologic version of Franz Kafka was used to incapacitate a patient to prevent him from mounting a significant defense for his using cannabis. Good to see the Patients Out of Time meeting here in California, because this is perhaps their largest attendance ever, and it shows how the medical cannabis movement has burgeoned and grown virtually exponentially here in California. I believe that the time is rapidly approaching when we're going to have a legitimate and legal access and hopefully to safe cannabis, because I believe that all cannabis should never be represented as being safe unless it is tested for being free from pesticide residues or other contaminants, because we have to be regulating ourselves in order to prevent the government from making excessive and harmful regulations.
That was Dr. Mikaria being interviewed in 2006. We have links to the entire interview that's posted on YouTube at normalaudiostash.com. We'll hear from his friends and colleagues today, remembering Todd, whose impact on the issue of medical marijuana cannot be overstated. He is rightfully called the father of medical marijuana. First, let's hear from NORML's founder, Keith Straub.
Well, Todd's a fascinating man. I first met him, I think, in about probably 1971, but it was very early. I had started NORML in late 1970, and fairly early on, I became aware of this group called the Morphia. It was a group that had it formed on the West Coast, but it actually had roots even further back on the East Coast. But there were 3 or 4 principals, and one of them was Dr. Todd Micarea, another was Gordon Brownell, another one was Michael Aldrich, Dr. Aldrich, and the 4th was Blair Newman. And their concept, I think, was brilliant in a way. It may have been a little ahead of its time, but it's something that if we could put together today, I think it would have enormous value. They had decided that they would like to form a group to legalize marijuana, and indeed it was the group that they were an outgrowth from was called LEMAR, that was formed on the East Coast by poet Allen Ginsberg and others in the 1950s. Well, LEMAR morphed into a Morphia, and their concept was they would sell rolling papers that sold under the brand name of Acapulco Gold, which back then was the marvelous name. You know, we didn't have all these fancy new names of train wreck and skunk and whatever else. But Acapulco Gold was kind of the cultural slang for the best marijuana you could get. So they sold these rolling papers under the brand name of Acapulco Gold and used the money to fund a program to legalize marijuana. So in some ways it was perfect symmetry, a brilliant concept, I think. At any event, for a number of years, 2 or 3 years, Morphia and NORML were very competitive. We were both seeking basically the same legal changes, and we were kind of going to the same group of funders to try to raise money. Eventually, I'm happy to say, some folks intervened and forced us to sit down together, and what we ended up doing was merging. Morphia became the West Coast office of NORML in about 1973, I think. Gordon Brownell, who had been their political director, became the director of our West Coast office, and a fellow named Mark Heitlinger, who had been their business manager, moved to the East Coast and became the business manager at NORML. Well, Dr. Micarea, who of course had been one of their thinkers on the subject and a person who knew an enormous amount about marijuana, not just the medical use of marijuana, but the whole history of marijuana, and had written extensively on the subject, he became one of the expert witnesses that we looked to whenever we needed an expert to back up our political theory. I might indicate, by the way, that although that was in the early 70s when we merged, I used Todd Micarea as an expert witness as recently as 60 days ago. Willie Nelson, who's always been a big supporter of NORMLs, had called me because he had a friend of his in Hawaii who had been busted for marijuana possession and who had a religious defense he wanted to raise. And Todd was one of the experts that we flew in from the mainland to testify on behalf of this friend of Willie Nelson. So it is indeed a sad thing to think about Todd's passing. He's played a major role in the marijuana legalization movement since the early 1970s. He'll be sorely missed.
Michael and Michelle Aldrich from San Francisco, California, had a lifelong friendship and working relationship with Dr. Micarea. They worked with him on his early activism.
I met Todd for the first time in 1972. I had been working in Washington, D.C., and I met my husband at the first National Pot Conference, which NORML did. And at that point, Michael said, come out and work on the initiative. And he was with Morphia, and so I came out and joined Morphia, and on the board of directors was Todd Micarea. And he immediately became my doctor, and then till Sunday he was my doctor. Many times we had NORML fundraisers at Terrence Hallinan's office, and he would come serenade me in his minstrel outfit that with his, I don't know if it was a lute or not, but sing songs, and that's when he went to the Renaissance Fair. And he would do the Renaissance Fair and go around and sing songs to people. I mean, there are so many layers to Todd that it won't be until history puts it all down, because he will definitely go down in history. We sold Acapulco rolling papers, and all profits went to legalize marijuana. And we funded the first time marijuana was ever on a ballot. And that was Proposition 19 in 1972. We got 33% of the vote, and which was just amazing to us. I mean, all of a sudden, you know, someone is talking about legalizing marijuana, and 33% of the whole state of California was there for it. And Todd was one of the signers
and
that promoted the initiative. So every time you turn around, Todd was always there, always involved in everything.
Michael Aldrich is a respected cannabis researcher in his own right and published papers with Dr. Mikaria. I asked him how much of an influence Todd had been on him.
For my own personal influence, it was profound. I first met Todd in 1969 at a legalization conference that I held in Buffalo, New York. And Todd was very young and had just gotten out of working for the National Institute of Mental Health and doing marijuana research for them. And he alerted us, this was an audience of about 4,000 roaring kids. And Todd got up in his suit and tie, as always, and presented two issues to us. He said, everybody wants to smoke dope for fun, but think about the hundreds and hundreds of years of people who've used it for medical purposes to help treat, you know, many different kinds of illnesses. And in my mind, that is the first time that I really thought about the medical side of our movement. And it was Todd that alerted the whole movement that the medical side was very important. And as it has emerged in California, the medical side is the leading side of this issue at the present time. And that's mostly due to Todd. The other thing he talked about in terms of research at my conference in 1969 was he presented for the first time in public that the Department of Defense, he had discovered while he was working at NIMH, Department of Defense was conducting research on marijuana as a troop incapacitant. In other words, could they invent some form of marijuana that they could maybe blow over a battlefield and it'd knock all the soldiers down? Something like that. It was a weird idea. And Todd discovered that this kind of secret Department of Defense research had been going on for many years, and he exposed that to the public for the first time. And now there's a book about it, and one of the people who worked on that original program for the Department of Defense has come to Todd and told him he'd be willing to write an article about it. So Todd has again been vindicated. The most important thing, I think, however, was simply Todd's dedication to working for the medical aspects of marijuana use. It was particularly exposed when he published his book, Marijuana Medical Papers, 1839 to 1972. And that was the first major publication in modern times about the medical uses of marijuana and about its splendid thousands of years old history as a medical treatment. And when that book came out in 1973, it instantly awakened worldwide knowledge of stuff that had not been taught in medical schools for at least 50 or 100 years. So I regard Todd as the real, genuine pioneer. This was 10 years before Bob Randall and many other people climbed on the medical marijuana issue. And to my mind, Todd is the great pioneer of the modern medical marijuana movement.
And Dr. Mikaria's work really had a profound influence on a broader community than just his friends.
You know what the most important aspect of that was? We published several papers together. We talked about the potency issue. We talked about W.B. O'Shaughnessy. We published a paper about the cost of enforcing the marijuana laws in California and all the savings that we got from passing the Moscone Act, which Todd also had a great hand in 1975. But the most important thing is that Todd was very actively involved in the wording of Proposition 215, which decriminalized medical marijuana in California. And he was responsible personally for the sentence. They gave a list of diseases and medical conditions that marijuana was good for. And Todd had the brilliance to add to that list or any other illness for which marijuana provides relief. And that's written into the initiative that was passed by the voters. What it means is that the government bureaucrats can't just say it's good for cancer and AIDS and you can't use it for anything else. What it did was open up the future of research on medical uses of marijuana in such a way that he believed his patients. He believed what patients told him about what marijuana helped with their various conditions. And because he believed in his patients, he became the model for a doctor who would listen understandingly. Most doctors won't listen to you when your patients are talking about marijuana. It's illegal. I mean, my gosh. And what Todd personally did was to make sure that in California, at least, any other illness for which the patient and the doctor agree that marijuana is beneficial can be signed up and registered as an official medical marijuana patient in California and can get marijuana medicine legally. And that is the great, great achievement. Todd was an iconoclastic icon, and he will be remembered by all of us forever.
Todd also inspired a new generation. Here's Dr. Mitch Earlywine.
I was thinking back on a favorite paper of mine that he had written in 1970. So, I was in kindergarten when this came out, and it was about using cannabis as a potential therapy for treatment of alcoholism. And you can imagine at the time how people just freaked out at this, and Todd was just so bold and so brave to lay this out, and he had case experiences, and he was just being really candid about this. And it's funny because that paper has an optimism and just a jovial medical approach to how this could really help folks who are really struggling. And it wasn't until, literally 30 years later when I met him and saw him, in the midst of having, his medical license challenged every time he turned around and just the beating he took towards the end about what was really data-based, intuitive, wonderful approaches to medical problems. If this had been aspirin or willow bark or, some other herb that didn't have the history that cannabis had, he would have been, a hero in, the American Medical Association. And instead, he was literally, having to watch his back everywhere he turned. It was just very, very sad. And as ill as he was getting towards the end, he was still really eager to help folks and would go almost anywhere to give folks a clinical interview and to help them out and to recommend all kinds of treatments, not just cannabis, in an effort to make sure that the suffering among us could suffer a little less. When I think about folks my cohort and just a little older, it tends to be that Todd opened up the idea that, we've got actually tons and tons of data from, literally hundreds of years ago, before cannabis was even prohibited. We need to open this back up again. And his first big book, goes back to, some references in the 1700s saying, hey, medical marijuana is for real. And this was back in the era when you would buy tinctures at the pharmacy, just like you would buy any other medication. And that we had data on this and that it was already something that we could make decisions on based on the publications that were already available. And I think there was something about that opened up the eyes of a whole bunch of folks saying, holy cow, we don't need to start from scratch. We've already got the evidence right here. And then that is what then inspired, once the Schaefer Commission and Nixon and all these other things, suddenly those guys had their eyes opened as well. And it seemed that was an era, especially when Carter was president, when suddenly we could really turn this around. And the fact that it hasn't, a lot of folks really got defeated and kind of left the field, and it was wonderful that Todd was just not going to let go and stayed for the rest of his life.
Dr. Miccaria was also a pioneering activist who helped pen some of the most important portions of California's Prop 215, the law that allows medical marijuana access in California. Having a psychiatrist involved with legal reform and Prop 215 was instrumental. Here's Keith Strum.
Well, I think, by the way, it was important for two reasons. One is during those early days and when that Prop 215 was being drafted, most physicians were afraid to get involved. It was still considered too radical, regardless of whether they personally felt marijuana might have benefit to patients. To say so would subject you to a good bit of ridicule and sometimes complaints to the medical association. So it took a lot of courage to get involved, and to get involved in such a public manner. Not only was Dr. Micarea one of those people who had the courage to do that, but over the first decade of Prop 215, there were tens of thousands of patients who, for whom he gave a medical recommendation. So their very legal ability to use marijuana as a medicine was dependent upon Todd's commitment to this issue. It got him in trouble. Again, they filed several complaints with the state medical association, and he had to sort of prove that he was not some wild and reckless physician. But in the end, he always maintained his license, and he never bowed for a moment from his position that there were literally thousands of legitimate medical uses of marijuana.
If your livelihood is going to hang out there because you've taken these steps to help some of the sickest of the sick, it's understandably a frightening thing. It's easy for me as an academic to say, hey, medical cannabis, go, but I'm not going to lose my job over it. I'm not going to suddenly not have a paycheck. Whereas these guys, that's a very real possibility. And I think the bravery behind what Todd has done, Frank Lucida, all these guys who are out there really in the trenches is something that we can't overestimate. It's really, really important.
And how much of an influence did having a medical professional involved have? Again, here's Dr. Mitch Earlywine to tell us how that influence can play out.
Well, all of the persuasion literature suggests that an authority can be more persuasive than just your average person. And I think in this domain, you have to trust somebody who understands this literature and understands science and can explain it well. And Todd, of course, was the forefront of all of that. He could walk you through the cannabinoid metabolism in a way that made it very clear and very simple and made a compelling case. And I feel like that's a model for us all. And in truth, it's funny because, I see him as an activist, and he's somebody who worked very hard on the bills that passed in California and has, phrasing that isn't in the, some of the other state legislation. But it didn't start out that way. I think he started out just as a physician who wanted to help patients, and it was like the obviousness and the Hippocratic oath of all of this, of I'm here to help people, is what dragged him in. And it's funny how many activists say, well, I didn't really start out as an activist. I was just looking at the data. And that in my case, too, when I was understanding marijuana, I didn't know how things were going to turn out. I just was looking at the data. And the next thing you know, you're following the logic, and suddenly it pulls you in, and you realize, hey, this is a real injustice that people can't get medicine that could really help them.
Michael Aldridge tells us that Dr. Micarea willingly put his career and his life on the line for his work regarding cannabis.
Yes, that's right. He decided at one point in the 1990s to devote his practice entirely not just to general psychiatry, but to cannabis psychiatry and cannabis medication. I think that grew out of his historical sense, but I also know that it had to do with his childhood. He was born in 1933 with a Japanese father and a German mother. Can you imagine what it was like growing up with the name Micarea in a little town in Pennsylvania during World War II? He was shot at. Literally, he told me he was shot at. He was chased by mobs of classmates. He was beat up all the time. And I think that affected his life, obviously. It made him anti-authoritarian in the sense of always questioning things and always being willing to turn around and face the bullies that were charging after him. I'm crying because it makes me so sad to see that this man who has led our movement for so many years is now gone to us. He was our doctor. He was funny. He was provocative. He was extremely intelligent and one of the brightest scholars in the field of medical cannabis research. He was our doctor. He was our colleague, and he was our friend, and he will be sorely missed by all of us who carry his torch onward.
We'll have links to Dr. Micarea's website as well as more information about his work on our website today at normalaudiostash.com.
Listening to NORML's Daily Audio Stash, the growing truth about cannabis. Make sure you visit our website at normalaudiostash.com. That's NORMLAUDIOSTASH.com for more information about every day's show. I'm your host, Chris Goldstein. Thanks for listening today. See you at 4:20 tomorrow.